I want to first of all talk a little bit about Paul as a character. Okay, what do we know about this man? Well, as we read last week, he encounters Jesus in Acts chapter 9 around about AD 33, 34, so 3 to 4 years after Jesus is gone. Jesus commissions him. He preaches in Damascus where he was, about to persecute Christians. He preaches in the synagogues there. He ends up a few years later in Jerusalem where he meets Peter and some of the original apostles that walked with Jesus, no doubt asking them to share their stories about Jesus' life and ministry and miracles and teachings. In fact, it seems highly likely that he might have even got a copy of an early copy of Matthew's gospel with some of Jesus' teachings in writing when he was down there in Jerusalem. But then, of course, as is often the way with Paul, he is driven out of Jerusalem under threat of his life. Basically, he is persecuted by the Jews down there who are not happy that one who was on their side has now suddenly had a massive turnaround and is preaching this heresy about Jesus. And then after being expelled from Jerusalem, he basically disappears for 10 years. He goes into exile. He goes in completely off the grid for a decade until Barnabas grabs him and takes him up to Antioch, about 500 kilometers north of Jerusalem, where he basically helps this growing multi-ethnic church there, and from there bases his apostolic ministry 14 years after his first encounter with Jesus. So obviously those 10 years, were not wasted. Though he may not have been in public ministry, but no doubt he spent that decade honing his message, studying, going back to the scripture that he'd studied all his life, seeing how that matched with the Jesus that he encountered on the Damascus Road, with the stories of the apostles in Jerusalem, with the sayings of Jesus, the teachings that he had in writing from what Jesus had taught over those 3.5 years. Paul used that decade to hone his message, so when he emerged from that, he became one of the most powerful, in fact, you could really argue, the most influential Christian in human history. A great choice for Jesus to choose to be his witness to the non-Jewish world. Not only a passionate man, but a man who loved and valued the scripture and was able to put it all together in a way that made sense to both Jews and non-Jews. And of course, Paul also had a great mix about him as a man that was very relevant to that culture. Do you remember a few weeks ago I did a video on the intertestamental period? What made the world that Jesus was born into? And I said that there were three things. The world of the first century, the world we're interested in anyway, was formed by Roman politics, the culture of Greece or Hellenistic culture, and the religion of Second Temple Judaism. These are the three ingredients that make the New Testament world, basically, okay? Well, guess what? Saul of Tarsus had all of those three things in his personal life, all right? He was a Roman citizen. Politics of Rome. He was well acquainted with Greek culture and philosophy. In fact, we see this week he argues with Greek philosophers and quotes their own philosophers to them. So he was very well acquainted with Hellenistic culture. But lastly, he was a Hebrew of Hebrews, and the Hebrew Bible, he was trained in Jerusalem by Judaism's best teachers, and the Old Testament oozes out of every pore of his being. So this is one of the reasons that these are some of the things that made Saul of Tarsus, or Paul the Apostle, who he was and made him so effective in this part in history. All right, so you're really going to enjoy reading him these next 5 weeks. This week, running out of breath. This week we read his earliest 3 epistles, okay? They're all written in the mid to late 40s, okay? Galatians, and then 2nd Thessalonians and 1st Thessalonians, because I believe that's the order that they were written. Read it that way and I'm sure you will agree. Okay, here's 3 things I want you to look out for as you read the epistles and the book of Acts this week. The first thing is very obvious. Pay attention to the pattern of Paul's ministry. Basically, where he goes to the Jewish community first and preaches the gospel to them, explaining the scriptures. But then from that very same community, persecution comes and he has to move on to the next place. And this is a pattern that goes over and over again. It's the very thing that Jesus promised to his original apostles, and Paul the apostle faces it in spades. Preaching and then persecution. But the other thing that Luke in this book of Acts is really takes a note of bringing out. is that when Paul was in a city and the Jewish people opposed him so much that it caused a riot or civil unrest, or Paul sometimes was even locked up in Roman prisons and beaten, Luke is very careful to say that none of that was Paul's doing. None of that was Paul's initiative. And this is really important because at the end of the book of Acts, Paul is in Rome in a prison about to go on trial. And so it's important for Luke to write to say, listen, Paul, while everywhere he's gone, there has been civil unrest has followed. It was never Paul's fault. Paul was innocent of causing that. It was always, only ever, his Jewish religious opponents that caused that civil unrest. All right, so just notice that because that is a thread that goes all the way through the book of Acts. And it's one of the reasons that some of us believe that Theophilus, who book of Acts was written to, might have been on Paul's defense team. He might have been one of Paul's legal defense attorneys, basically, or have something to do with Paul's trial, because all that narrative about Paul being innocent, Paul is not, he is a friend of Rome, all right? He's a friend of Rome. The only people that are causing problems are the first century religious Jews who oppose his message on religious grounds. So keep that in mind. The persecution that comes against Paul is always by religious zealots, just like he was, okay? Before he encountered Jesus. It's always coming from that camp, never from the Romans properly. Okay, so just keep that in mind. The second thing to pay attention to is something that we've done all the way through this series, and is notice the corroboration between the narrative and then the other books. So in the Old Testament, we'd read narrative stories and then the prophets or the Psalms. Or in the Gospels, we'd read 4 narrative stories together and they basically formed a composite picture. Well, I definitely want you to notice that this week we're going to read the narrative, and there are certain things that are not mentioned in there that Paul brings out in his letters to give us a nice bigger picture. So for example, this week you're going to be reading about Paul going to Thessalonica, and it seems like the first thing he does when he gets there is goes to the synagogue to preach. But actually, when he writes his letter to them, you find out that's not the first thing he did. The first thing he did when he went there was get a job. He started making tents. And so reading the two together gives you a bigger picture. When you read Galatians, you find out that when he first went to them, he had something wrong with his eye. He had a weakness in his body where they loved him so much they would have torn out their eye and given it to him. And you think, well, what was that? Was that some disease? Was it conjunctivitis? Was it malaria? What the heck was that? Well, when you read the book of Acts, you find out that when he first went to Galatia, it was straight after he'd been stoned almost to death. He'd been pummeled in the face with rocks. And so when he went there, he didn't have conjunctivitis. He had bruised and battered face and eyes that were damaged from being stoned. That was the problem that he had. So you read the both together and you get a fuller picture. Just notice that and appreciate that in your readings this week. And the third and final thing I want to draw your attention to, as always, is the way that here in the New Testament, in the age of fulfillment, we see the authors going back to the Hebrew Bible and referencing the Old Testament. Well, Paul does that in spades. He references the Old Testament a great deal, sometimes quoting it and sometimes alluding to it. And this week especially, I not only want you to take notice of how Paul references the Old Testament, but how he also very strongly seems to references Jesus' own teaching on the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 23, 24, 25. He echoes a lot of that teaching. And I believe that the scrolls that Paul traveled with was not only some of the Old Testament Bible, but was also, as I said before, some of Jesus' teaching written down. So keep that in mind. All right, as you read the book of Galatians, you're going to see him talk about a new creation and a new Jerusalem. He contrasts the Jerusalem of that day and a heavenly Jerusalem. Well, that's language straight out of the end of Isaiah. At the end of Isaiah, he talks about God's enemies being burned with fire. And that's the very same thing he says to the Thessalonians about their Jewish enemies and what was going to happen with them. So he seems to be referencing the end of Isaiah a lot. In fact, he seems to say when the day of the Lord that was coming against his enemies would thrust God's enemies from his presence. What is that? Well, it's a direct reference to 2 Kings, when the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom and the Babylonians destroyed the southern kingdom. It says in both of those instances, God's people, God's covenant people, were thrust from his presence. He uses the same word, not a direct quote, but a very strong allusion to those Old Testament references. So keep that in mind. And particularly in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, there's a lot of similar language, as I said, to Jesus' teaching in Matthew 23, 4 and 5. In fact, one of the things you might want to do this week, before you read Thessalonians, but both of those letters, is to read Matthew 23, 4 and 5, and read the last 2 chapters of Isaiah. Have that language fresh in your mind to see whether that is what Paul is alluding to or mentioning as it just shapes him, okay? The Old Testament just oozes out of this guy in direct quotes and allusions. You're definitely going to notice that this week, all right? I think that's enough. Guys, enjoy the book of Acts. You're reading 3 chapters this week. Keep reading it with a map. Okay, because you're going to have to trace Paul's travels. Please do that. Remember to hyperlink if you've got time to go back and read the Old Testament. And lastly, and I just want to say this once, I can't talk about it too much because it'll take up too much time, but I want you to read those 3 epistles in one sitting each, and I want you to do it in this order: Galatians, 2 Thessalonians, then 1 Thessalonians, because I believe that 2 Thessalonians was actually written first. And I can't go into that because it would take way too long. All right, guys, this video's gone for 11 minutes. Okay, I think we've survived. Well done. Last week we read Paul's first 3 epistles in chronological order, Galatians and Thessalonians. This week we're reading his 4th letter, which is 1 Corinthians, and I'm going to spend most of my video on 1 Corinthians today. In the narrative, all we're doing is reading Acts 18 and 19, which explains how the Corinthian letter came about, basically, okay? What we're going to see is that in Acts 18, Paul goes to Corinth for the very first time, and unlike other cities that he's been to recently, he gets to stay there for quite a long period of time, about 18 months. So they receive him quite well. The persecutors there don't drive him out of the city like they did in other places. He gets to stay there for a good amount of time, and in doing so gets to establish a strong kind of church community in that city. Well, after a year and a half, he goes down to Jerusalem, back to Antioch, which is his home base, and on his 3rd ministry trip ends up in Ephesus for 2 years. And it's there in Ephesus that he writes back to the Corinthian believers in around about AD 54-55. Timothy takes the letter to them, and so that's where we get the letter of 1 Corinthians. Okay, so there we go. 1 Corinthians is one of those quite controversial letters. Actually, there's a lot of strange passages in there. There's a lot of uncertainties. There's a lot of disagreement. So I want to encourage you as you read Corinthians this week, don't get lost in the detail. Remind yourself of the big picture, and I'm sure you'll get something out of it. I hope this helps. There are 3 things I want to draw your attention to as you read through Corinthians this week, and I hope you enjoy. The first thing is to really pay attention to Paul's relationship with this church and his reason for writing to them. As I said, he's writing from Ephesus about a year and a half or so after he's left them to their own devices. And the reason he writes to them is because they have written to him and they've asked him a bunch of questions. He's got a letter from them. Secondly, people from that church have come to him and asked and said to Paul, look, we're quite concerned about a bunch of stuff that's going in our church. Can you please do something about it? So the whole letter of Corinthians is a response to those issues, those questions, and those concerns. And one after one, chapter after chapter, he deals with each of those issues as a father would address his children. And that's where the relationship thing comes in. I want you to notice, and Paul says this himself, he says, listen, I'm like a father to you in the gospel, so please trust that I have your best interests at heart as I write these things. And like a good father, he applauds them for things they're doing well, and he adjusts them on things that they're not quite doing so well. And so that fatherly heart, like he did with the Thessalonians, he said to them, we were like a mother to you, we were like a father to you. Well, it's the same with the Corinthians. He's not a professional preacher that just came through town to sell a few books and preach a message and leave. No, he is an apostolic father to this church, and that heart really comes out. And I also want you to notice when he writes to them that sometimes he tells them, look, this is God's will in this situation. He's very clear on that. This is God's will. And yet other times he says, look, I'm not actually sure what God's will is, but here's my advice as your dad. Okay, here's my advice, take it or leave it. Here's my advice on this particular matter. And so that's a really good thing, I think, that you can see in Paul. His fatherly heart comes out to them. So pay attention to the relationship he has and the reason that he's writing to them. It's a response to all their issues and concerns. The second thing I want you to pay attention to, and this is a bit fun, is the quotations that Paul uses, all right? Like all the New Testament books we've read so far, the Gospels and Acts and the other epistles, he quotes the Old Testament over and over again. Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Job, Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Hosea all get a mention in this letter. He also quotes Jesus at the Last Supper. He also quotes a Greek poet when he says bad company corrupts good character. Apparently that's a quote from a Greek prophet. He also quotes a rhetorical question when he says, somebody might say, just somebody, how are the dead raised? It's a rhetorical quote. But the main thing I want you to pay attention to is how he quotes the Corinthians back to themselves. Okay, remember I said he's responding to a letter that they had written them. Well, it seems that he takes that letter, quotes that letter back to them, and then gives his answer time and time again. So, for example, they say, listen, everything is beneficial for me. And he says, yeah, but you shouldn't be mastered by anything. They say, the food for the stomach and stomach for food. And he said, yeah, but you need to still exercise self-control. They say, it's good for a man to not marry. And Paul says, well, it can be good, but it can also not be good. Sometimes men should actually marry. And so what he does is he quotes their questions or concerns back to them and then addresses it with his answer. And one of the reasons I bring this up is because one of the controversial things and contradictory things that Paul seems to say in this letter is in chapter 14, where he says, women, should not speak in the church. It's disgraceful for women to speak. Which is really confusing because just a couple of chapters earlier, chapter 11, he talks about women praying and prophesying in church. So how can he say that and then a few chapters later say women should not speak? Well, I believe it's because there in 1 Corinthians 14, he's quoting their letter back to them. Someone in that church in Corinth said, women should not speak in church. And that's the quote he's quoting back to them. And then he says this, as you continue to read, he says, excuse me, do you think the word of God originated with you? You should listen to what I teach about women, like in chapter 11. And if anyone wants to ignore what I teach, well, you just ignore him because he doesn't know what he's talking about. So I believe that's what he's doing. It's some of the editors or translators in our Bibles don't put the quotation marks there, but I believe that they should. Because here's the point. In first century Greek writing, they didn't have quotation marks. It's up to our Bible editors to try to suss out where they go. And I think one should go there. I don't think Paul himself is saying women should not speak. I think he's responding and quoting their letter back to him. The point is simply this. Not every word spoken in this or written in this letter is from Paul. He sometimes quotes their teaching or their, beliefs back to them as he gives his explanation. I'm sure that'll make sense as you work your way through. Okay, the last thing I want you to pay attention to, what is it? Is Paul's main theme through the letter. So he deals with a heap of issues, but as I see it, there is one underlying theme that goes literally from beginning to end. And it's basically this. It's the relationship between the individual and the collective. Okay, the relationship between the individual and the body, or the temple, or the group, or the community, or the church. And Paul, from beginning to end, that theme I can see working through. So in the opening chapters, when he talks about being divided, he says, look, as individuals, you're dividing up over your favorite preachers. You need to be unified as a group. And the only way that will happen is when you focus on Jesus and Jesus only. When he talks about sexual sin and some of them getting divorced and taking one another to court, he says, listen, these individual decisions don't just affect you. They have a negative effect on the whole group. So please deal with those issues and don't let it get to that. When he talks to them in chapter 8 through to 10, he says, listen, as individuals, you might have personal liberties and rights, but at times it is wise for the sake of the collective to relinquish those rights for the sake of the group. When he talks about church meetings, he says, listen, every one of you might have something to contribute, but when it comes to what is best for the group, it needs to be done in an orderly way that's going to benefit everyone. So this theme constantly comes through. And of course, the underlying theology in that is that individuals don't just come to Christ on their own. Well, they do. You have an individual relationship with Jesus. But when you do, you are baptized or become part of a collective group, a covenant community. And he says it's the same thing that happened in the first Exodus with Moses, okay? Those people came out of Egypt, and when they came through the Red Sea, they were baptized into the body of Moses. They were baptized into Moses, into a Moses community. And so again, he makes this distinction between covenant communities, the community of Moses, the collective body of Moses, and the community of Christ. So I want you to notice this. And the interesting thing is this mindset of the individual and the collective, the individual's relationship with the collective, even goes into his teaching on the resurrection, because he says, how are the dead, those individual dead, raised? In what body do they come? They come into a resurrected body, not resurrected bodies. Okay, those individuals do not have their own resurrected bodies. Those individuals are raised in a collective body that is immortal and imperishable. Well, at least that's one theory about what he's talking about there. You can look at that yourself. Just don't get too lost in the details, all right? Finally, a couple of last things as you read this letter. Please understand this is very important. When you read Corinthians, it's like we are listening to one part of a two-way conversation, all right? We can hear what Paul's saying, but we don't really know what the Corinthians are asking. We don't really know what's truly happening in that church. We're kind of left to try to piece it together. So some things seem a little uncertain to you. That's why you're listening to a two-way conversation, but you're only hearing one part of it, and so that's why it can be a little confusing at times. The second thing is, while he deals with a whole bunch of issues, his intent is not to give a comprehensive theology on all of those areas, because remember, it's a response letter, and so he leaves a lot of things unsaid. After all, he's just spent a year and a half teaching them, hour after hour after hour, day after day after day, week after week after week. He taught them heaps of stuff. This letter is just a snapshot to respond to some of the questions they have. So, we can't develop big theologies just out of this letter. That's not the point of it. It is a response letter to him. And so if you leave this letter with questions, that's absolutely fine. It's not there to answer every question, dot every, I and cross every T. That's not the purpose of it. It's a response letter. And lastly, I want you to realize as you read through Corinthians this week that essentially you and I are reading somebody else's mail. This letter was not addressed to Bayside Church in the 21st century. It was written to the Corinthian church in the year 54-55 AD. And so many of the things that he talks about specifically have very unique application for that church. Things like head coverings and food sacrificed to idols. These are cultural issues from Corinth that are coming out in their experience. However, behind each of those specific examples is a general truth that you and I can definitely learn from, whether it's God's will being expressed or whether it's Paul's fatherly wisdom and advice coming through. You are definitely going to take some things away from this letter this week and find application for them in your own life. All right, so enjoy Corinthians this week. If you can read it in one sitting, do so. It's quite a long letter. You might want to take 2 or 3, but remember, read big chunks at a time, and then of course follow his journey in Acts 18 and 19. Next week we've got a couple more epistles, but I really hope you enjoyed this week. Bless you heaps, and I'll see you then. Bye. That's it for today's lesson. I really hope you enjoy your readings this week. Remember, allow yourself time to read as much as you can in one sitting. Don't get lost in the detail. Just keep going and watch the Bible's big story unfold before you. Remember also to hit me up on our social media channels or website, and I'll see you next time.